Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open. I had responded to plenty of strange calls before that night. Most people who work emergency calls for any length of time have. You learn quickly that the first details you get from dispatch are rarely the whole story. A call may come in as a person acting strangely, a welfare check, trouble breathing, chest pain, panic, or someone refusing to leave a room. By the time you arrive, it can be something completely different. That is why I tried not to make assumptions before walking up to the house. Still, something about the call had already put me on edge. We had been told there was a man inside who was frightened and refusing to come out. He had apparently said he was safe where he was, that he could not leave because they could find him. There was no clear answer as to who they were. The information was vague, the kind of thing that makes you prepare for several different possibilities at once. Maybe he was having a psychiatric crisis. Maybe he was intoxicated. Maybe he had dementia or some other medical issue. Maybe he was simply terrified by something real. You never know until you get there. My partner and I pulled up to the house in the evening. The area was quiet, almost too quiet. It was one of those older residential streets where the houses sat close enough together that you could usually hear televisions through open windows, dogs barking behind fences, or people talking in their yards. But that night, there was nothing. No music, no voices, no lights from neighboring homes that I could remember, just the dim shape of the house in front of us, and the faint sound of our vehicle settling after we parked. The house itself looked old but lived in. It was not falling apart, but it had the tired, closed-in look of a place that had seen too many years. The porch light was on, though it was weak and yellow. It barely lit the front steps. The windows were dark. I remember noticing that right away. There was no glow from a television, no kitchen light, nothing to suggest that someone had been calmly moving around inside before we arrived. We approached the front door and knocked. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then we heard a man's voice from inside. "Come in," he called. His voice was loud enough to hear clearly, but it did not sound normal. It sounded strained, breathless, like he had been holding himself together by force. There was a sharp edge of panic in it. I knocked again, partly to let him know who we were, and partly because I did not like walking into a dark house without another clear response. "Emergency services," I said. "We're coming in to check on you." Again, he yelled for us to come in. But he did not move. That was the strange part. The voice was somewhere deeper inside the house, but there were no footsteps coming toward the door. No sound of locks turning, no sign that he was going to meet us. It was as if he had called out from wherever he was hiding and expected us to make our way to him. The front door was unlocked. We stepped inside. The entryway was dark, with only a small amount of light coming through from another room. The air inside felt stale, not rotten or obviously dangerous, just closed up. It was the smell of old carpet, dust, furniture, and a house that did not get much fresh air. "Sir," I called, "where are you?" His answer came from farther in. "I'm safe here," he said. "They can't find me here." The tone of his voice made my partner and I look at each other. At that point, I was already thinking this could turn into a psychiatric call. The man sounded deeply frightened, but not confused in the ordinary way. He sounded like someone who believed he was in immediate danger, even though we had not seen any sign of another person in the home. I told my partner to go grab some equipment from the vehicle. It was not necessarily because I thought the man was physically ill. It was just habit. When someone is acting unusually, especially when they are frightened and hiding, you prepare for more than one outcome. Things can change quickly. A person who looks like they are having a panic attack may be having a cardiac issue. A person who seems confused may have low blood sugar, a stroke, an overdose, or any number of medical problems. My partner headed back outside. I stayed inside with the man. I followed his voice down a short hallway and into what looked like a living room or den. The room was dim. One lamp was on somewhere near the far wall, but it did not light much. The shadows were deep in the corners. Furniture sat in uneven shapes around the room, and for a moment I had to let my eyes adjust before I could see where he was. Then I found him. He was on the floor, partly hidden behind a piece of furniture. He was crouched low, his back pressed against the wall, as if he had tried to make himself as small as possible. His knees were pulled close to his chest. His hands were shaking. His face was pale, and his eyes kept moving toward the ceiling and then back toward the room. He looked terrified. Not dramatic terrified, not angry or aggressive. Terrified in the way a child looks when they are trying not to cry because they believe something is nearby. I lowered myself a little so I would not be standing over him. "Hey," I said calmly. "You're okay. We're here to help. Can you tell me what's going on?" He looked at me, but his eyes kept flicking over my shoulder. "They're looking for me," he said. "Who is?" I asked. He swallowed hard. "The Wampers." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. "The what?" I asked. "The Wampers," he said again. He said it with complete certainty. Not as a joke. Not as a strange word he had made up on the spot. He said it as if he expected me to know exactly what he meant. "They've come to collect me." I kept my expression neutral, even though I had no idea what he was talking about. In emergency work, you learn not to argue directly with a person's fear unless you have to. If someone believes something is after them, telling them they are wrong can make them shut down, panic harder, or stop trusting you. The better approach is usually to acknowledge that they are scared and gently guide them toward safety. "Okay," I said. "I understand you're frightened, but I'm here with you now. You're not alone. Can you come out from there so we can talk?" He shook his head. "No," he whispered. "If I move, they'll see me. Who will see you?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the ceiling again. That was the first time I noticed how often he did it. Every few seconds, his eyes would jump upward. Not toward a light fixture or a sound in the room. Upward, like he was tracking something directly above us. I looked at the ceiling too, just to see if there was a stain, a hole, an animal scratching around, anything that might explain why he was focused on it. There was nothing obvious. The ceiling was old, slightly uneven in places, but intact. I tried again to get him to move. "Listen to me," I said. "You're doing okay. Take a slow breath. You don't need to stay on the floor. Let's get you up, sit you on the couch, and we can figure out what's happening." He looked at me for a long time. His breathing was fast and shallow. His hands were clenched. I could see him trying to decide whether I was safe or not. Finally, after several minutes of talking, he seemed to soften a little. He loosened his grip on his knees. He took one deep breath, then another. "Good," I said. "That's it." Nice and slow, he nodded slightly. I held out my hand, not forcing him, just offering it. Eventually, he reached for it. His hand was cold. I helped him stand. For a brief moment, he seemed better. He straightened his back. He took a long breath through his nose, then let it out slowly. His shoulders dropped. His eyes looked more focused. I remember feeling relieved. It seemed possible that the worst of the panic had passed. Maybe he had just been overwhelmed by anxiety. Maybe he had not slept. Maybe he had been alone too long and his mind had gotten away from him. He was standing there now. He was breathing. He was listening. I thought we might be able to sit him down, check his vitals, and talk through the next steps. Then he froze. It was so sudden that I noticed it before I understood it. His entire body went rigid. His eyes widened. He looked directly at me. And in a voice so quiet I almost had to lean closer to hear it, he said, "It sees me." I asked him what he meant. He did not answer. He slowly lifted his eyes toward the ceiling. "It's in the attic," he said. At that exact moment, we heard a violent slam above us. It was loud enough that it shook the room, not a small creak, not the settling of an old house. A hard, heavy slam from somewhere directly overhead. The man screamed, then he collapsed. At first, I thought he had fainted from panic. His body dropped so quickly that I barely had time to reach toward him. But when I got down beside him, I knew immediately that it was worse. He was unresponsive. No normal breathing. No meaningful movement. Everything about the situation changed in an instant. The fear, the strange words, the attic, the slam, none of that mattered anymore. It became a medical emergency. My training took over. I checked him. Then I started chest compressions. I called for my partner as loudly as I could. "Get in here," I yelled. The room felt suddenly too small. I was focused on the man beneath my hands, counting, keeping the rhythm steady, trying to block out everything else. That is what you do in a moment like that. You narrow your world down to the person in front of you. You stop thinking about the house. You stop thinking about the strange conversation. You stop thinking about what caused the emergency. You just work. I yelled for my partner again. And then I felt someone standing in front of me. I could sense a figure near the man's body, positioned directly across from where I was kneeling. At first, I assumed it was my partner. It made sense. I had called out. My partner had gone for equipment. I expected him to return quickly. For a few seconds, I continued compressions without looking up. Then, something felt wrong. There was no sound of equipment hitting the floor. No voice. No movement that felt familiar. No quick, focused response from someone stepping into a cardiac arrest scene. Just a presence. A shape. I looked up. It was not my partner. I do not know how to describe what I saw in a way that sounds reasonable, because it did not make sense even while it was happening. There was a dark shape standing in front of me. It was not solid in the way a person is solid. It looked blacker than the darkness in the room, almost like the room's shadows had gathered together into one upright form. I could not make out a face. I could not make out clothing. I could not tell if it had arms or legs clearly. It was there, but my eyes could not hold on to it. For 1 second I saw it. Then it was gone. Not walking away. Not moving toward a door. Not disappearing into the hall. Gone, it vanished so quickly that my mind could barely process it. It was like someone had switched off an image. One moment there was something standing in front of me, and the next moment there was empty space. I stopped breathing for half a second. Then I heard movement behind me. My actual partner came through the doorway. The door was held open by one of those small hydraulic slide mechanisms at the top, which meant it should not have moved on its own. It had been open enough for my partner to come through, and now he was there with the equipment, looking at me and the man on the floor. He asked what happened. I did not answer immediately. I could not. I kept doing compressions, trying to force my mind back into the emergency. My partner took over parts of the response, and we worked on the man as we had been trained to do. Everything after that became a blur of movement, instructions, equipment, and adrenaline. But I never stopped thinking about the shape. It had been standing where my partner should have been, and it had vanished before my partner entered the room. Later, once the immediate emergency had been handled and we were preparing to leave the house, I finally noticed something near the front hallway. The attic door was open. It had fallen down from the ceiling. The folding ladder was halfway extended. That was the slam we had heard. There was no question about it. The sound had come from the attic hatch dropping open. It made sense physically. The slam was real. The attic door had opened. The ladder had partially unfolded. Something mechanical had happened above us. But that did not explain why the man had looked up moments before and said, "It sees me. It's in the attic." It did not explain why he collapsed immediately after the slam. And it did not explain what I saw standing in front of me while I was working on him. I stood in the hallway for a moment, staring up at the attic opening. The ladder hung down at an angle, only partly extended. Above it was darkness, deep darkness. No light came from the attic. No sound. No movement. Nothing visible. I remember feeling an urge to look up farther to see if anything was there, but I did not. I had no desire to climb that ladder. I had no desire to stand underneath that opening longer than necessary. The house had felt wrong from the moment we arrived, but now it felt like it was holding its breath. We left. I did not say much about what I saw that night. How could I? I was trained to handle emergencies, not explain things that had no explanation. I could say that the man was frightened. I could say that he spoke about something called the Whompers. I could say that he believed something was in the attic. I could say the attic door fell open, there was a loud slam, and he went into cardiac arrest. Those things were facts. But the shape was not something I knew how to put into a report. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe the low light, adrenaline, and panic of a sudden cardiac arrest made my mind create an image from shadows and movement. That is possible. I have considered it many times. But I know what I felt. I know I sensed someone standing there before I looked up. And I know that when I looked, it was not my partner. It was something dark. Something that disappeared faster than I can explain. The house has been vacant for almost 12 years now. I do not know why it was left empty. I do not know whether the man survived. I do not know what happened to the property afterward. I only know that it has sat there, unused and silent, for years. Sometimes I think about that house. I think about the man hiding on the floor, convinced he was safe where he was because they could not find him. I think about the strange word he used, the Whompers. I think about the way he finally trusted me enough to stand up, only to freeze and look toward the ceiling as if he had seen something I could not. And I think about the attic door slamming open at the exact moment he said it was there. Most of all, I think about the black shape that stood in front of me while I was trying to save his life. I still do not know what it was, but I know it was not my partner. When the internet was still fairly new, I had an experience in a house that I used to house sit for quite often. It was one of those homes I became familiar with over time, not because I lived there, but because the family trusted me enough to look after the place whenever they were away. I had stayed there before, checked the doors and windows, fed pets when needed, brought in mail, and spent nights there without much trouble. It was a quiet house, comfortable in most ways, and I knew the layout well enough that I could move through it in the dark without turning on every light. Still, there was one room in that house I never really liked. The moment you walked in through the main entryway, there was a door immediately to the left. Behind it was a spare bedroom that had been turned into an office. It was not a large room, but it had everything a home office needed at the time. A desk, a computer, a printer, filing cabinets, shelves, and a chair that was much more comfortable than it looked. It was the room where the family kept their paperwork, old photos, computer equipment, and all the usual things people do not want lying around in the rest of the house. The first thing that always caught my attention in that room, though, was not the computer, it was the portraits. There were at least 2 painted portraits on the walls, maybe more. They were portraits of deceased family members, people who had clearly meant something to the homeowners. I never knew much about who they were. I do not remember their names, and I do not remember whether they were grandparents, great-grandparents, or other relatives. But I knew they were dead, and I knew the paintings had been put there intentionally, like a way of keeping those family members close. There is nothing inherently creepy about portraits. Plenty of people have old family paintings in their homes, but these ones made me uneasy from the beginning. Maybe it was the style, maybe it was the lighting in that office. Maybe it was simply because the people in the paintings looked so serious. Neither of them was smiling. They were dressed formally, from what I remember. Their faces were pale in the muted colors of the paintings, and their eyes seemed lowered or pointed slightly downward. It was hard to tell exactly what their expressions were supposed to be. They did not look happy, but they did not look openly angry either. They had the kind of expression people in old portraits often have, stiff and distant, as though smiling would have been considered improper. But when you sat at the desk, it felt like they were looking down at you. Not directly, maybe, not in an obvious way, but enough that I always noticed them when I was using the computer. The desk sat in a position where if you looked up from the screen, you could catch one of the portraits in the corner of your eye. I would try not to look at them too much. It was easier to focus on the computer and pretend the room was just another room. At the time, having access to the internet felt different than it does now. It was not something constantly running in the background on every device you owned. You had to sit down at an actual computer, connect to the internet, wait for it to work, and hope nobody picked up the phone line while you were online. The process itself had a sound. You would turn on the computer, wait for it to finish waking up, then connect to the internet and hear all those strange electronic noises. There would be a bing, then a bong, then a kind of mechanical whirring sound. Then came the little doot-doot-doot noises and the harsh, scratchy connection sounds that made it feel like 2 machines were arguing with each other through a telephone line. Back then, those sounds were normal. They were annoying, but normal. So one evening, while I was house-sitting, I decided to use the computer in the office. The family was away, the house was quiet, and I had time to kill. I had done this before. I sat down in the desk chair, turned on the monitor, and waited for the computer to come to life. The room was dim, except for the glow of the screen. I do not remember whether I had turned on the overhead light. I may have left it off, because the computer screen gave enough light for what I was doing. Or maybe there was a lamp somewhere in the room. Either way, the office did not feel bright. The corners were dark, the furniture looked heavier in the low light, and the portraits on the wall seemed more noticeable than they did during the day. I connected to the internet and listened to the familiar sounds. Bing, bong, whir, doot, doot, doot. Then the connection went through, and after a few minutes, I was surfing around online. It was the early internet, so there was a lot of clicking from page to page, waiting for images to load, opening random links, and letting boredom guide you from one strange corner of the web to another. At some point, I ended up on an adult website. I was alone in the house, younger, bored, and had the privacy of being in someone else's office while the family was away. It was not exactly something I was proud of, but it was also not unusual for someone alone with a computer late at night. I had the screen in front of me, the room quiet around me, and I was focused on what I was doing. That was when I heard the hiss. At first, it was faint. So faint that I was not even sure I had heard it. It sounded like a short burst of air, almost like someone letting out a quick breath through their teeth. Hiss. I stopped for a second and listened. Nothing. The computer was still making its normal, low mechanical noises. The hard drive hummed. The monitor gave off that faint electrical buzz old screens sometimes had. The house itself was quiet. I told myself it had probably been some sound from the computer, or maybe something from the website. I went back to what I was doing. A little while later, I heard it again. Hiss. This time, it was clearer. It was not coming from the speakers. It was not connected to anything on the screen. It sounded physical, close and low. The sound seemed to come from somewhere under the desk. I paused again. For a few seconds, I did not move. I just listened. Then it came again. Hiss. Longer this time. More pronounced. I felt a small wave of discomfort go through me. It was not full fear yet. I was not thinking ghosts or anything supernatural. My first thought was something practical. Maybe there was an animal in the room. Maybe there was a cat somewhere behind the desk, though I did not remember the family having one. Maybe some kind of pipe was making a strange noise. Maybe there was a loose cable or a computer fan that had started acting up. But the sound did not seem mechanical. It sounded alive. I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked down toward the space under the desk. The desk was large enough that there were shadows beneath it. There were cables, the computer tower, and the usual dust and clutter that collect under furniture. I expected to see a snake. That was honestly my first thought. A snake. I do not know why my mind went there so quickly, but the sound was so close to a snake hissing that I could not think of anything else. I imagined some small snake coiled under the desk, maybe startled by my feet, maybe trapped in the room, maybe angry because I had sat down so close to it. I bent down and looked. There was nothing there. No snake, no animal, no movement, no shape hiding behind the computer tower. Just cables, shadows, and a dusty floor. I sat back up, confused. The hiss stopped for a moment, and I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it had been a sound from outside. Maybe air had moved through a vent. Maybe something in the house had shifted. Older homes make noises sometimes, even when they are not that old. Pipes settle. Air conditioning clicks on and off. Wood expands and contracts. Houses have their own strange language if you listen long enough. So I tried to ignore it. I went back to the computer, but after a few minutes, it started again. Hiss. This time, I felt it in my chest. The sound was still coming from under the desk, or at least from somewhere close enough that it felt like it was under my knees. It happened once, then again, then again. It was not loud, but it was steady enough that I could not stop paying attention to it. Hiss, hiss, hiss. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it became. It was like the sound grew sharper once I admitted it was really there. I kept glancing down, half expecting something to crawl out from under the desk. I even lifted my feet from the floor at one point because I did not want anything brushing against my ankles. Nothing appeared. That should have made me feel better. It did not. The office suddenly felt different. The air seemed heavier. The glow from the computer screen no longer felt comforting. Instead, it made the rest of the room seem darker. I became very aware of the paintings on the wall behind and beside me. I looked up at one of the portraits. The person in it looked serious, as always. But now, with the hissing continuing under the desk, that serious expression no longer felt neutral. It looked disapproving. It looked like a scowl. I looked toward the other portrait. Same thing. The eyes seemed darker than before. The lowered face seemed more severe. I knew they were just paintings. I knew the expressions had not changed. But the longer I sat there, the more it felt like both portraits were looking down at me with open judgment. And of course, I knew exactly why my mind was going there. I was sitting alone in a family's office, using their computer, looking at something I probably should not have been looking at, while portraits of their deceased relatives watched from the walls. It sounds ridiculous when you say it plainly. At the time, it did not feel ridiculous. It felt like I was being watched. I tried to laugh it off. I told myself I was being stupid. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the strange sound had put me on edge, and now I was letting the portraits get into my head. I kept scrolling, kept clicking around, trying to act as though nothing was happening. But the hissing would not stop. It was not constant. That would almost have been easier to understand. Instead, it came in short bursts, just often enough to keep me tense. Every time I began to relax, it would happen again. Hiss, then silence, then another hiss. At some point, I stopped caring about the computer entirely. I sat there listening. The office had become a room I wanted to leave, but I did not want to admit that I was scared of it. That is a strange feeling when you are alone. You can leave at any time. Nobody is forcing you to stay. But if you leave because you are frightened, then you have to accept that you are frightened. You have to admit that something in the room has gotten to you. I tried one more time to look under the desk. I pushed the chair back, leaned forward, and shined the light from the monitor down into the shadows. I looked behind the computer tower. I looked near the wall. I checked the cables. I checked the floor. There was still nothing. No snake, no rat, no cat, no broken piece of equipment, no obvious source for the sound. When I sat back up, I made the mistake of looking toward the portraits again. They seemed to be scowling. I know they probably had the same expressions they had always had, but in that moment, I could not see them any other way. Their faces looked hard. Their eyes looked lowered in a way that felt intentional, as though they had been watching the entire time and had finally decided I did not belong in that room. The hissing came again. Hiss. That was when I finally stood up. I did not slam the chair back or run out of the room. At least not at first. I stood there beside the desk, looking around, trying to gather myself. I felt foolish and nervous at the same time. The room was still quiet, except for the computer humming softly and the occasional hiss from somewhere I could not see. I backed slowly away from the desk. Then I headed toward the door. Before stepping out, I said something out loud. I do not know why I said it. Maybe it was because talking to the empty room made me feel less helpless. Maybe I was trying to make a joke out of my own fear. Maybe, deep down, I was speaking to whoever or whatever I felt was there. I said, "Fine, if you want me out, I'll step out." I said it while backing toward the doorway. Then I stepped fully into the entryway. The second my body cleared the office doorframe, the door slammed shut in my face. Slam. It was not a slow movement. It was not the kind of soft closing a door makes because of a draft. It shut hard. Hard enough that I jumped backward. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it. I did not speak. I did not reach for the handle. I did not try to open it again. The door had answered me. That was how it felt. I had said that if whoever was in there wanted me out, I would step out. Then the instant I left, the door slammed shut. I stood in the entryway for what felt like a long time, trying to process it. There had to be an explanation, I told myself. Maybe there was a draft. Maybe the door had been partly unstable on its hinges. Maybe the air pressure changed when I stepped out. Maybe I had pushed it without realizing. But none of those explanations felt right in the moment. The timing was too exact. The door did not slowly swing shut. It slammed immediately after I spoke. I remember feeling the hairs rise on my arms. The house was quiet again. The hissing had stopped. There was no sound from the office. No more strange breathing noise from under the desk. No movement. No scratching. No sign of anything at all. Just the closed door between me and that room. I did not go back in. Instead, I retreated to the kitchen. The kitchen felt safer because it was open and brighter. I turned on lights. I stayed near the counters. I may have made myself something to drink or found something to eat, though I do not remember exactly. I just knew I did not want to go anywhere near the office again that night. For the rest of my stay, I made sure to stay out of that room. I did not use the computer again. I did not open the door to check if anything had changed. I did not inspect the desk or look for a source of the hissing. I left it alone. Every time I passed through the entryway, I noticed that closed office door. I would glance at it, then quickly look away. The portraits were on the other side. The desk was on the other side. The computer was on the other side. Whatever had been hissing beneath it was on the other side too. And I had no interest in finding out whether it was still there. The strange thing is, I kept house-sitting for that family over the next couple of years. I went back to that house more than once. I spent nights there. I checked on it when they traveled. I did the same things I had always done. But after that night, the office was never just an office to me again. It became the room I avoided. There were other strange things that happened in that house over the years. Things I still cannot easily explain. Not all of them were as dramatic as the door slamming, but enough happened that I never completely forgot the feeling I had that night. Still, the office incident is the one that stays with me most clearly. Maybe it was a mechanical problem. Maybe a vent made the hissing sound. Maybe an animal had somehow gotten into the wall or under the desk and escaped before I looked. Maybe the door really did close because of a draft at the exact wrong moment. Maybe the portraits only seemed to scowl because I was nervous and ashamed of being in there doing something I should not have been doing. All of that is possible, but I know what it felt like. I know I heard the hiss coming from under the desk. I know I looked and found nothing. I know the dead family members in those portraits seemed to stare down at me with expressions that felt colder the longer I stayed. And I know that when I finally said, "Fine, if you want me out, I'll step out," the office door slammed shut the second I crossed the threshold. After that, I stayed out of the office for the rest of the visit, and every time I went back to house sit for them after that, I made sure that door stayed closed. When I was around 6 years old, my family had just moved into a dingy old duplex that never felt comfortable to me. I was too young to understand why it bothered me, but even then I could tell there was something different about that place. It always seemed darker than the homes we had lived in before. The walls were dull, the rooms felt cramped, and the lighting never seemed bright enough, even during the day. At night it felt worse. The shadows in the corners looked deeper than they should have, and every room had that old, stale feeling that made you want to stay close to people instead of wandering around alone. I don't remember everything about that duplex, but I remember the kitchen. I remember how the floor felt under my feet when I walked through it at night. I remember the table sitting in the middle of the room, usually covered in whatever my family had left there during the day. Papers, bags, toys, clothes, small things that had no real place to go. I remember the refrigerator too, because it was one of the few things in the kitchen that gave off any real light at night. When the door opened, the bright white glow would spill across the floor and briefly make the room feel safe. Then, when the door closed, everything would fall straight back into darkness. One night, when everyone else was asleep, I got out of bed because I wanted something to eat. I was probably not supposed to be up, At that age, the house felt completely different when the adults were asleep. During the day, it was just our home. At night, it was quiet, in a way that made every little noise feel bigger. The hum of the refrigerator sounded loud. The pipes made strange little sounds in the walls. Even the floorboards seemed to notice when you stepped on them. I remember walking slowly down the hallway toward the kitchen, trying not to wake anyone. I was tired, but I had that childish feeling that maybe there would be something good in the fridge. Maybe leftover food. Maybe a snack. Maybe something sweet I wasn't supposed to have. The kitchen was almost completely black when I walked in. I could barely see the table. I could barely see the outline of the counters. Everything was just dark shapes against darker shapes. I went straight to the refrigerator, opened the door, and stood there looking inside. There was nothing I wanted. No snack, no leftovers that looked good, nothing interesting at all. I remember feeling disappointed in that simple, childish way. I had gotten out of bed, walked through the dark house, and there was nothing there. So I closed the fridge door. The bright refrigerator light disappeared instantly. For 1 second, my eyes had not adjusted to the darkness yet, and in that second I saw something sitting on the kitchen table. At first, it didn't even look like a pile of things. It looked like a person, not just any person. It looked exactly like one of our family friends, a woman I cared about deeply. She was someone I looked at like a second mom. She was always kind to me. She was familiar, comforting, and important in my life. She was one of those adults who made you feel safe simply because they were around. But the figure sitting on the kitchen table did not look safe. It looked like her, but dead. I remember it sitting upright on the table, perfectly still. It looked like her body had been placed there and left there in the dark. The shape of the head, the body, the way it seemed to be sitting up, it all formed in my mind at once. I did not have time to question it. I did not have time to think about how impossible it was. My brain saw a dead body, and it saw the face of someone I loved. I froze. When people talk about being scared, they usually describe screaming, running, or crying. That was not what happened to me. I could not scream. I could not move. I could not even think clearly enough to understand what I was looking at. My body just shut down. The fear was so strong that my tongue went numb. That is the detail I have never forgotten. Even now, decades later, I remember the strange feeling in my mouth. It was like my tongue had suddenly stopped being part of my body. It felt heavy and numb, almost useless. I remember trying to breathe, but feeling like I could not get a full breath. My chest tightened. My legs would not move. My eyes stayed locked on the table. I was 6 years old, standing in a dark kitchen, convinced that someone I loved was sitting dead in front of me. For a moment, it felt completely real. The darkness made the shape look solid. The shadows gave it form. The small amount of light coming through the house made it seem like there was a face there. I could see enough to be terrified, but not enough to understand what I was actually looking at. I just stood there. I have no idea how long it lasted. It could have been a few seconds. It could have been longer. When you are that scared, time changes. A few seconds can feel endless. You notice every part of your body, your heartbeat, your breathing, the cold feeling in your arms, the numbness in your mouth, the silence of the house around you. Slowly, my eyes began to adjust. At first, the shape changed only a little, then more. Then the horrible face I thought I saw was gone. The body shape started to break apart into separate objects. What I had thought was a person sitting upright on the table was actually just a pile of junk. Bags, clothes, maybe boxes, maybe papers. maybe things that had been dropped there earlier in the day. I cannot remember the exact items now, only that they were ordinary things. Things that had no meaning. Things that should not have scared me. But in that one instant, after the refrigerator door closed, those ordinary objects became something else. They became a dead body. They became someone I loved. I remember feeling relief, but it did not come all at once. Even after I realized it was just junk, I could not immediately make myself move. My mind understood it was not real, but my body was still trapped in the fear of what I had thought I saw. I kept staring at the table, trying to force myself to see the objects for what they were. I probably stood there much longer than I needed to, because I was afraid that if I looked away, it would change back. Eventually, I made it back to my room. I don't remember if I ran or walked quickly. I don't remember if I told anyone the next morning. I do not even remember whether I slept after that. I only remember lying in bed and replaying the image in my mind. The face, the shape, the body sitting upright on the table. The fear that had hit me so hard it made my tongue go numb. Even as a child, I knew it had probably been the dark playing tricks on me. I knew that when the fridge light went off, my eyes had been caught between bright light and complete darkness. I knew that things can look strange in shadows, but knowing that did not make the memory go away. It did not make the image less real in my mind. That moment stayed with me. As I got older, it became one of those strange childhood memories I would think about from time to time. I would remember it when I walked into a dark room at night. I would remember it when a pile of clothes looked like a person in the corner. I would remember it whenever I heard people talk about seeing things in the dark and then realizing their eyes had fooled them. Still, I never forgot how exact it looked. I never forgot that it was not just some random shape. It was someone I cared about, someone I trusted, someone who felt like another mother to me. The thought of seeing her dead had struck me so hard that it stayed buried somewhere deep in my memory. Life moved on after that. A few years later, that woman moved away. She was still important to me, but distance changes things. When you are young, adults come and go from your life in ways you do not always understand. You miss them, but you assume they are living their life somewhere else. You think they will always be there, even if they are not nearby. Then I grew up. I became an adult. I became a father. I had children of my own. Life changed in all the normal ways it does. There were jobs, responsibilities, bills, stress, and the daily work of trying to keep everything together. At some point in my mid-20s, the woman I had thought of as a second mom came back into my life. She moved in with me. By then, I was a single father, working and trying to raise my kids. Having her there meant a lot. She watched over my children while I worked. She helped in the ways family helps, not always with big dramatic gestures, but with the everyday things that matter most. She was there when my kids needed someone. She helped give them stability. She became part of our home. In a way, she stepped into a role that felt familiar. When I was a child, she had felt like a second mom to me. Now, as an adult with children of my own, she was helping take care of them. There was something full circle about it, though I did not think of it that way at the time. I was just grateful she was there. I was grateful my kids had someone who loved them. I was grateful that I could go to work knowing they were safe. But she had health problems. Her weight had caused serious issues with her heart, and there were times when things got bad enough that an ambulance had to come. Those were frightening times. Seeing someone you care about taken away in an ambulance changes how you look at every quiet day afterward. You start to notice every sign that they are tired. You listen for changes in their breathing. You worry when they take too long to get out of bed. You try not to show it, but the fear sits in the back of your mind. There were periods when she spent weeks in the hospital. When she came home, there was always a mixture of relief and worry. We were glad to have her back, glad to see her sitting in the house again, glad to hear her voice. But there was always the knowledge that her health could turn suddenly. The hospital stays, the ambulance calls, the heart issues, they were reminders that things were fragile. Still, after coming home, she seemed to be doing better. She stayed with me for about 3 years. During that time, she became part of the rhythm of the house. My kids knew her. She was there when I left for work. She was there when I came home. She was part of our family in every way that mattered. And then, one day, everything changed. It was dark in the house when we found her. I remember that detail because darkness has always been tied to the first memory I had of her. The kitchen in the duplex had been dark. The refrigerator light had gone out. My eyes had formed something terrible from shadows. This time, it was not shadows. This time, it was real. We found her passed away in her room. She was sitting up, in the same position my eyes had created decades earlier in that dark kitchen. That is what has stayed with me. Not just that she died, not just that we found her. Those things would have been painful enough on their own. But the way she was positioned, sitting upright in the darkness, brought back that childhood memory so quickly and so clearly that it felt like time folded in on itself. For a moment, I was not an adult anymore. I was 6 years old again. I was standing in that old duplex kitchen. I was staring at the table. I was frozen in fear. I was looking at what I thought was her dead body. And then I was back in the present, older, with children of my own, staring at the reality of something I had seen only as a nightmare when I was a kid. I cannot explain how deeply disturbing that was. People often say that childhood fears are just imagination. And most of the time, they are. A shadow becomes a monster. A coat hanging on a chair becomes a person. A pile of clothes becomes a body. You grow up, you understand what happened, and you laugh about it later. But this did not become something I could laugh about. I had seen an image of her sitting dead in the darkness when I was 6 years old. I knew, logically, that it had been nothing more than my eyes trying to make sense of junk on a table after the refrigerator light went out. I knew that was the reasonable explanation. I still know that now. But years later, when she died, we found her in that same kind of position. Sitting up. Still. In the dark. And suddenly that old memory did not feel like a random childhood scare anymore. It felt like something I had seen before. I have spent a lot of time trying to understand it. I have tried to tell myself that the human brain connects things after trauma. Maybe the position she was found in was not exactly the same as what I saw as a child, but close enough that my mind tied the two memories together. Maybe I had carried that image for so long that it became a pattern, and when something tragic happened, my brain reached for it. That is possible, probably even likely. But it does not change how it felt. It does not change the shock of seeing the two moments connect after so many years. The first time, I was terrified because I thought I saw something impossible. The second time, I was terrified because it was real. Sometimes I wonder if my mind was simply preparing me for a grief I would not understand until much later. Sometimes I wonder if that childhood moment was just a strange coincidence that gained meaning only after she died. Sometimes I wonder if there are things we notice without understanding, tiny images that stay with us because they are connected to something waiting farther down the road. I do not know. I do not claim to know. All I know is that the memory has never left me. I remember the old duplex. I remember the dark kitchen. I remember the refrigerator light going out. I remember seeing her shape sitting on the table. I remember the fear taking over my entire body. I remember my tongue going numb. I remember realizing it was only junk. And then, years later, I remember finding her in the dark, sitting up, gone. The woman who had been like a second mom to me when I was a child. The woman who came back into my life and watched over my children while I worked. The woman who became part of my home again. I still think about her often. I think about all the time between those two moments. I think about how she moved away and came back. I think about how life brought her into my children's lives. I think about how strange it is that the image I saw as a terrified 6-year-old somehow returned when I was grown. Maybe it was only coincidence. Maybe it was my childhood imagination shaped by darkness and fear. Maybe the mind has a way of storing certain images because it knows they will matter later, even when we do not understand why. But no matter what explanation I try to settle on, I will never forget that first moment in the kitchen. And I will never forget the final moment years later when I realized the image that had frightened me as a child had somehow come back into my life in the most painful way possible. When I was around 16 years old, I had an experience that still bothers me whenever I think about it too much. It happened late at night, probably somewhere between 11 and midnight. I was in my bedroom reading a book with my door closed and my table lamp on. Nothing about the night felt strange at first. It was one of those quiet nights when everyone in the house was already asleep, and I was trying to stay awake just a little longer because I was caught up in whatever I was reading. My bedroom was upstairs. It was a normal room in a normal newer house, the kind of place that should not have felt creepy at all. We lived in a newer suburban development at the time, with houses that were all built around the same period. There was nothing old about it. No long history, no dark Victorian hallways, no creaky floors that had been there for 100 years. It was a modern house with clean walls, newer carpet, bright fixtures, and regular bedrooms upstairs. That is part of why the memory has always stuck with me. If it had happened in an old house, people might immediately say that old homes make weird noises, settle in strange ways, or have a creepy atmosphere at night. But this house was still fairly new. I was sitting on my bed, reading under the light of my table lamp. The rest of the room was mostly dark. The lamp made a warm circle of light over my book and part of the bed, but the corners of the room were dim. My door was closed, and the hallway outside was dark, because all the lights in the house had already been turned off. My grandma was staying with us at the time, and she was sleeping downstairs on the floor below me. I knew that. I knew everyone else was asleep. The whole house had that deep nighttime silence where even tiny sounds stand out. You can hear the air conditioning kick on. You can hear pipes shift somewhere behind the walls. You can hear a floorboard creak from another room and wonder if someone is awake. I was completely focused on my book when I heard my bedroom doorknob begin to turn. At first, it was only a small sound, a faint movement of metal. But when it happens in a quiet house at night, you notice it right away. I stopped reading for a second, but I did not look up. That was the strange part. I had a sudden, deep feeling in my stomach that told me not to look at the door. It was not a thought I formed slowly. It was immediate, almost like an instinct. I remember feeling that if I looked directly at the doorway, I would see something that would scare me badly. I know that sounds dramatic, but that is honestly how it felt. It was like my body reacted before my mind had even figured out why. So I kept my eyes on the book. I tried to act like nothing was happening. I kept reading the words on the page, though I was no longer taking any of them in. My eyes moved across the lines, but I could not focus. Every part of me was listening to the door. I was trying to stay calm and tell myself it was probably my grandma checking on me. Maybe she had gotten up during the night, and wanted to see if I was still awake. Maybe she was just making sure I had gone to sleep. But the feeling in my stomach did not go away. The doorknob turned again. Then the door slowly began to open. I still did not look directly at it. I was staring at my book so hard that I probably looked ridiculous, pretending to read while every nerve in my body was focused on the doorway. But the door was close enough that I could see movement in my peripheral vision. I could see the dark shape of the door changing as it opened wider. The hallway beyond it was completely dark. No hallway light came on. No voice said my name. No one asked if I was still awake. I could see the door moving, but I heard no footsteps. That was the first thing that made my fear rise. If it was my grandma, she would have made some kind of sound walking upstairs or down the hallway. The house was not silent enough for someone to move around without making any noise at all. Still, I kept trying to tell myself, it had to be her. The door opened farther. I did not turn my head. I could feel myself getting more scared with every second. My heart was beating hard, but I stayed still on the bed. I had that childish instinct people sometimes get even when they are older. The idea that if you do not look at something, maybe it cannot fully become real. For a few seconds, I kept my eyes locked on the book. Then something in me made me glance toward the door. It was only a quick look, a last-second look. I did not stare. I did not fully turn my body, but I saw enough. At the edge of the doorway, just as something seemed to be leaving, I saw the bottom of a black, ruffled skirt. It was dark, almost black against the darker hallway, but the shape was clear enough that I knew what it looked like. It had layers or ruffles, like an old-fashioned skirt. The best way I can describe it is something Victorian-looking, though I am not saying it was literally from that period. It just had that kind of shape. It did not look like normal pajamas. It did not look like something my grandma would wear to bed. It looked like the edge of a long, dark skirt with a ruffled hem, and it was moving away from my door. I remember seeing only the lower edge of it. No face, no body, no feet, just that dark, ruffled shape passing out of view. Then my bedroom door started to close. Slowly, it did not slam. It did not shut all the way. It moved back toward the frame, then stopped partly open. That was the moment the fear really hit me. I sat there staring at the small gap in the doorway, trying to understand what I had seen. The light from my lamp reached only a little way toward the door. Beyond that was the dark hallway. The room had suddenly gone from feeling ordinary to feeling completely unfamiliar. It was still my room, still my bed, still my book beside me, but it no longer felt like a safe place. For a few seconds, I told myself that it had to be my grandma. She was the only person who made sense. She was sleeping downstairs, but maybe she had woken up. Maybe she had come upstairs quietly. Maybe she was wearing some kind of dark robe or nightgown that I had mistaken for a skirt. Maybe the hallway was dark enough that my eyes had turned an ordinary shape into something strange. I held on to that explanation because I needed one. But then I realized something else. I had not heard her walk away. If she had opened my door, checked on me, and then gone back downstairs, I should have heard something. The hallway floor should have made some noise. The stairs should have made some sound. There was no way someone could go down a full flight of stairs quickly and silently, especially in the middle of the night. I sat there for a moment listening. Nothing, no footsteps, no stair creaks, no door opening downstairs, no sound at all. I did not want to leave my room, but I also did not want to keep sitting there with the door partly open. Looking at that dark gap was worse than getting up. I kept imagining the black skirt appearing again, just at the edge of the doorway. I kept imagining someone standing in the hall, waiting where I could not see them. Eventually, I forced myself off the bed. My hands were shaking a little. I remember reaching for my phone because it was the only thing that made me feel like I had some kind of control. This was early enough in the iPhone era that using the flashlight app still felt like a useful little trick. I turned it on and held the phone in front of me. The bright white light from the screen and flashlight made a small path through the darkness. I opened my door wider. The hallway was empty. The hallway light was off. Every light in the house was off. There was no one standing near my room. There was no dark skirt disappearing around a corner. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. Still, I did not feel better. Sometimes seeing an empty hallway after hearing or seeing something strange can be more frightening than seeing a real person. At least if it is a real person, there is an answer. But when the house is empty and you know something just happened, your mind starts filling the silence with possibilities. I stepped into the hallway, holding my phone out in front of me. The light moved across the carpet, the walls, the doors of the other upstairs rooms. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The upstairs area was quiet and still. I stood there for a second, listening again, wondering if I should call out for my grandma, but I did not want to yell. I did not want to wake everyone in the house unless I had to. Part of me was embarrassed, even though I was terrified. I kept thinking, what if it was just Grandma? What if I go downstairs and she tells me she was checking on me, and I have made a big deal out of nothing? So I started walking toward the stairs. Every step felt louder than it should have. I kept shining my flashlight ahead of me, then behind me, then down the hallway again. I knew it probably looked ridiculous, but I did not care. I was scared enough that I needed to see where I was going. The stairs were dark. I stood at the top for a moment, listening for movement downstairs. Nothing. I started going down slowly, one step at a time, holding the phone tightly. The flashlight beam bounced along the walls and steps. I remember feeling like I was doing something brave, even though I did not want to. I was still trying to prove to myself that there was a normal answer. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the house was silent. I made my way to where my grandma was sleeping. She was under the covers. She looked completely asleep. At first, I stood there unsure of what to do. I did not want to wake her up, but I needed to know if she had been upstairs. I leaned closer and whispered, "Do you need me?" She did not respond. I whispered again, asking if she had come upstairs or if she needed anything. Still nothing. She was asleep, not pretending to be asleep, not awake and ignoring me. She looked like she had been sleeping the entire time, settled under the covers, breathing normally. There was nothing about her that made it seem like she had just gone upstairs, opened my bedroom door, and rushed back down. That was when I felt truly scared, because the only explanation I had been holding on to was gone. It had not been my grandma, or at least it did not seem possible that it had been. I stood there beside her for a few more seconds, looking around the downstairs area with my phone flashlight. The rooms were dark and quiet. Nothing was out of place. No one else was awake. There was no sign of anybody in the house. I remember whispering something like, "Okay," even though she was asleep and could not hear me. Then I turned around and walked back toward the stairs. Going back upstairs was worse than coming down. When I was walking downstairs, I had a purpose. I thought I was going to find my grandma and get an answer. But now, I had no answer. I had to return to the room where I had seen that black ruffled skirt at the edge of the doorway. And I had to do it knowing that my grandma had been asleep downstairs the whole time. I climbed the stairs slowly, shining my flashlight up ahead of me. Every dark corner looked dangerous. Every shape seemed like it could move. When I reached the top, I stood there again, staring down the hallway toward my bedroom. My door was still partly open. I could see the warm yellow light from my lamp spilling onto the floor through the gap. That normal little pool of light looked strange now. It felt like my room had become a place I had left behind, not somewhere I wanted to go back into. But I did. I walked down the hallway with my flashlight raised. Nothing moved. No one was there. I pushed my door open all the way and stepped inside. The room looked exactly the same as it had before. My book was still open on the bed. The lamp was still on. The air in the room felt normal, but I did not feel normal anymore. I looked at the door, then at the dark hallway behind it. I wanted to close it fully, lock it if I could, and never look at it again. I shut the door. Then I checked it. Then I checked it again. I probably stared at the doorknob for a while, waiting to see if it would turn. I do not remember how much sleep I got after that. I may have stayed awake for a long time with the lamp on. I may have kept the book open in front of me, just so I would have something to focus on. I do remember feeling deeply unsettled every time I looked toward the door. I was scared it would move again. I was scared I would see the black edge of that skirt in the small gap beneath it, or at the side of the frame. Nothing else happened that night. At least, nothing that I remember. But the memory stayed with me. What makes it strange to me is that I did not live in an old house. It was not a creaky farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It was not a historic building with a long, scary story attached to it. It was a newer suburban home in a newer subdivision. It was the kind of house where you expect normal explanations for everything. And maybe there is one. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I saw a shadow from the door, a coat, a curtain, or something reflected oddly in my peripheral vision. Maybe the movement of the door and the darkness made my brain create the image of a ruffled skirt. Maybe my grandma had briefly been awake and somehow made it back downstairs without me hearing her, although that seems unlikely. I have thought of all of those possibilities, but I still remember the feeling I had before I even looked. That sudden instinct telling me not to turn my head toward the door. I still remember the doorknob moving. I still remember the door slowly opening, and I still remember that quick glance, the dark, ruffled edge of what looked like a Victorian-style skirt moving away from my room as the door began to close behind it. I have never forgotten how scared I was walking back upstairs with nothing but my iPhone flashlight. At 16, I felt old enough to know better than to be frightened by shadows, but I still felt like a little kid moving through a dark house after seeing something I could not explain. To this day, I cannot say for sure what it was. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was my mind turning darkness and movement into something more frightening than it really was. But I know that when I checked downstairs, my grandma was asleep. And I know that when I went back to my bedroom, I did not feel alone in that house anymore. We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal. Came a kind of tradition for me and my grandma to travel every year to the same place, a town that celebrated its fiesta on the exact same day as my birthday. That connection alone made the trip feel special to me when I was younger. It was never really about cake, parties, or gifts. For us, it was about going there together, attending church, spending time with people my grandma knew, and keeping a routine that had slowly turned into something meaningful. Looking back now, I think that yearly trip mattered more to her than she ever said out loud. She liked routines, old friendships, and places that carried memory. I liked being with her. So every year, around my birthday, we would make the trip and stay for a short time in the same old house. The house belonged to one of my grandma's close friends. I had known that place for years, and because we visited so often, it felt familiar to me in a strange way, even though it was never really my home. It was an old concrete house, large compared to most houses in the area, with 3 bedrooms and a slightly cold feeling inside no matter what time of day it was. Even in the heat, the inside of the house always seemed cool. The walls were thick, the floors were hard, and the air inside carried that quiet, still feeling older homes sometimes have, like they are holding on to years of silence. Only my grandma's friend lived there, which always struck me as a little strange considering how big the place was. She slept in the smallest room, the one that seemed more practical and easier to manage for a person living alone. My grandma and I usually stayed in the bedroom right next to hers. That had become part of the routine too. Every year it was the same room, the same bed arrangement, the same feeling of arriving in a place that never changed. There was comfort in that predictability. I knew where everything was. I knew how the hallway looked at night. I knew the sound the bathroom door made when it opened. I even knew how the room felt just before sunrise. There was one room we never used though, the master bedroom. I had seen it before, of course. The door was sometimes open during the day, and I had peeked inside enough times to know it was much bigger than the other bedrooms. It had a heavier feel to it somehow. Not necessarily scary, just more serious, more private, like it belonged to a different kind of life. It had more space, larger furniture, and its own attached bathroom, which made it feel separate from the rest of the house. Even though nobody seemed to use it regularly, it still felt like the kind of room you weren't supposed to casually take over. But on my 16th birthday, that changed. When my grandma and I got there that year, we found out that our usual room was already occupied by another guest. I don't even remember now who the guest was or why they were there. All I remember is the small shift in the plan. It was one of those tiny changes that didn't seem important at the time. Since the room next to my grandma's friend was taken, there was really only one option left. We had no choice but to stay in the master bedroom. At first, that sounded more exciting than inconvenient. I was 16 by then, old enough to appreciate having more space and my own bathroom. The room was easily twice the size of the one we usually stayed in. The bed was larger, the ceiling seemed higher, and the attached bathroom made it feel almost luxurious compared to the smaller room I was used to. But even though it was technically the better room, I remember feeling just a little off after settling in. Maybe it was only because it was different. Maybe it was because I was used to the other room and didn't like change. Or maybe there was something about that bedroom that felt too quiet, too tucked away from the rest of the house. Still, I brushed that feeling aside. That evening went the way our visits usually did. The house was calm. My grandma spent time talking with her friend, catching up in that slow, comfortable way older people do when they've known each other for years. I stayed nearby, listening here and there without really paying attention. Outside, the town had the familiar energy of fiesta season. There were sounds in the distance, voices, movement, the occasional burst of noise from somewhere farther off, but inside the house, everything felt more muted. By nighttime, things had settled. The walls seemed to absorb sound, and once everyone had gone to bed, the place became deeply quiet. Since we were attending church early, I knew I had to wake up before dawn to get ready. That part was also part of the tradition. Waking up in darkness, moving quietly so as not to disturb anyone, getting ready before the rest of the world fully came alive. I had done it before in that house, just never in that room. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up and checked the time. It was around 3 a.m. The air in the room felt cool and still. For a few seconds I stayed in bed, half awake, listening to the silence and trying to shake off that heavy, sleepy feeling. The house made no sound at all. No footsteps, no doors, no voices. My grandma was still asleep. Everything around me felt dark and motionless. I got up, trying not to make too much noise, and went into the bathroom attached to the bedroom. The bathroom itself was ordinary. There was nothing dramatic or unusual about it. It looked like the kind of bathroom you'd expect in an older house. Functional, plain, a little worn with age, but perfectly normal. One thing I remember clearly is the small window high on one wall, put there for ventilation. It wasn't a large window, and it sat high enough that it didn't really draw much attention during the day. It was just there, one of those little details you notice once and then stop thinking about. I turned on the water and got into the shower. At first everything was normal. The sound of the water filled the space, making the room feel more enclosed. When you shower that early in the morning, especially in an old quiet house, it almost feels like you are in your own little world. The water blocks out other sounds. Your mind is still foggy from sleep. You go through the motions without fully waking up yet. That's exactly how I felt. Then something changed. I can still remember the moment because it was so sudden. 1 second, I was just showering, half asleep, thinking of nothing. The next second, a strong wave of goosebumps rushed over my whole body. It was immediate and intense, the kind of reaction that doesn't feel voluntary. My skin tightened, and every hair on my body stood up. The temperature of the water hadn't changed, but it suddenly felt like the air around me had gone cold. It wasn't just a random chill. It felt like the unmistakable feeling of being watched. You know how sometimes your body notices something before your mind catches up? That was what it felt like. Before I consciously understood that anything was wrong, my body already knew. I stopped moving almost completely. My breathing changed. My stomach dropped. And without even knowing why, I looked up toward the small window. What I saw there is something I have never forgotten. Staring back at me through that small, high window was a pair of eyes. For a moment, my brain simply refused to process what I was looking at. It was like my mind lagged behind my vision. I saw them, but I couldn't make them make sense. They were fixed directly on me, completely still, unblinking. Beneath them was a pale face, so pale it looked wrong in the dark. Not ghostly in the dramatic way people describe in stories, but unnaturally washed out, as if the face had no warmth in it at all. What stood out even more were the eyebrows. They were light, oddly blonde, or almost colorless, which made the whole face look even stranger. I froze. I don't mean I stood there in surprise for a second and then reacted. I mean, I genuinely froze. My body locked up. I was standing there totally exposed, completely vulnerable, and I could not make myself move. My mind started racing, but none of the thoughts made sense. The main one kept repeating itself over and over. How is anyone even there? That window was too high. There was nothing outside that wall, at least nothing I remembered, that would allow someone to stand at that height and look in. No ledge, no steps, no object that should have put a person's face there. And yet that face was there, perfectly positioned, staring straight at me as if that impossible angle meant nothing. For what felt like forever, neither of us moved. I just stared at it, and it stared back at me. The worst part was the eyes. They didn't shift. They didn't flick away in surprise the way a normal person's eyes would after being caught spying on someone in a shower. There was no shame, no panic, no sudden attempt to duck out of sight. If it had been some random creep, you would expect a startled reaction. You would expect them to jerk back or disappear the second they realized they had been seen. But that didn't happen. It just kept staring, unblinking, steady, almost angry, or maybe not angry exactly, but intense in a way that felt hostile. There was something deeply wrong in the stillness of that face. Even now, years later, I struggle to explain what made it so disturbing. It wasn't just that someone was looking at me, it was the way it was looking. Like it wasn't embarrassed, like it didn't care that I had noticed it, like it had been there longer than I knew. My brain kept trying to force a normal explanation onto the moment. Maybe it was a person. Maybe someone had climbed onto something. Maybe I was still half asleep. Maybe the shape of the window and the darkness outside were playing tricks on me. But none of those thoughts held for long, because the face remained there, too clear, too steady, too deliberate. I don't know how long we stayed like that. In reality, it was probably only seconds. But fear can stretch time until it feels thick and endless. Every second felt long enough for a full thought, a full panic, a full attempt to understand. I was so scared that my mind started splitting into different reactions at once. One part of me wanted to scream. One part wanted to run. Another part still couldn't accept that what I was seeing was real. Then, finally, something in me broke through the paralysis. I yelled, "Hey!" It came out loud and sharp, more out of shock than bravery. The second I shouted, I expected the face to vanish. I expected it to drop down out of sight immediately, the way any normal person would. That would have been frightening, yes, but it would also have made sense. Instead, what happened next was somehow worse. The face began to move. But it didn't move down. It didn't jerk away in panic. It didn't disappear quickly. It started sliding sideways across the window, slowly, so slowly that it almost didn't look natural. It moved in this awful, deliberate way, like it had no urgency at all. Like it wasn't escaping. Like it was simply choosing to leave the frame of the window at its own pace. That slow, sideways movement terrified me more than the staring had. There was something deeply unnatural about it. Human beings caught in a moment like that react fast. They flinch, duck, run. They don't calmly glide sideways out of view like they have all the time in the world. And that's exactly how it seemed. Not a scramble, not a retreat, a slow exit. By then, I was fully in panic. I don't even remember how I finished washing off or whether I properly did at all. I just remember wanting out of that bathroom as fast as possible. Every part of me felt exposed and unsafe. I was terrified to look back at the window and equally terrified not to. I got out of the shower in a rush, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I kept expecting to see the face again. I kept expecting a knock, a sound, some sign that whatever had been there was still just outside. But there was nothing, only silence. That silence made it worse, because if something had made noise, if I had heard footsteps or movement outside, then maybe I could have placed it in the normal world. But there was no sound at all, just the same quiet house, the same still darkness, the same feeling that something had happened that I could not explain. I don't remember every detail of what I said afterward. I'm not even sure whether I woke my grandma immediately or waited until there was more light outside. Trauma sometimes preserves the central image and erases the edges. What I do remember with total clarity is the decision I made after that night. I never spent another night in that house again. Not once. That single experience was enough. Maybe someone else could have explained it away. Maybe someone more rational or less frightened could have convinced themselves it was a trick of light, a person standing somewhere impossible. or a tired teenage mind reacting badly to an early wake-up, but I knew what I saw, and more importantly, I knew what I felt. It wasn't just surprise. It wasn't ordinary fear. It was the deep, immediate certainty that something was wrong. After that, whenever the yearly trip came up, I would still go if I had to, but I would not stay overnight in that house. I didn't care if people thought I was overreacting. I didn't care if it sounded dramatic. That room, that bathroom, that window, all of it had changed for me. What had once been a familiar place connected to happy memories with my grandma was now permanently attached to that face. Even now, when I think back on it, certain details come back stronger than others. The cold rush of goosebumps, the feeling of standing frozen under the shower water, the impossible height of the window, the pale face, the strange light eyebrows, the eyes that did not blink, and most of all, that horrible sideways movement after I shouted. That is the part that still gets to me. Because fear can make you misinterpret a shadow. It can make you imagine a face where there is none. But the slow sideways movement is what has always stayed lodged in my mind. It felt intentional, controlled, wrong in a way that still makes my stomach tighten when I remember it. I have gone over it again and again, trying to make it normal. I have tried to tell myself it must have been a person. Maybe someone found a way to stand there. Maybe there was something outside I didn't know about. Maybe exhaustion made everything feel stranger than it was. But none of those explanations erase the feeling of that moment, and none of them explain why the face behaved the way it did. All I know is that on my 16th birthday, in the master bedroom we were never supposed to use, I woke up at 3 a.m. to get ready for church, stepped into that ordinary bathroom, and found something staring at me through a window where no one should have been able to stand. It watched me in silence, without blinking, without shame, without surprise. And when I finally found my voice and shouted at it, it did not drop out of sight like a human being would. It slid away, slowly, as if it had never been afraid of being seen at all. After that night, I never slept in that house again. I was about 7 years old when this happened, and I'm 42 now, but I still remember it clearly because of how strange it felt at the time. A lot of childhood memories fade or get mixed up over the years, especially the small ones, but this one has always stayed with me. Maybe it's because I was old enough to remember the mood in the room and the way all the adults reacted, but still young enough to be deeply unsettled by something I couldn't explain. Even now, when I think back on it, I can still picture my Nana's house, the quiet country street outside, the board games spread out in front of us, and the sudden sound that changed the entire feeling of the night. My Nana lived in a small country town, the kind of place where everything gets quiet early. Her house was an all-brick ranch, sturdy and simple, and to me it always felt safe in the way grandparents' houses often do. It wasn't fancy, but it felt solid and familiar. The layout never seemed to change. The living room was comfortable and cozy, and at night the house would settle into that kind of quiet that only exists in rural places, where there's no steady background noise from traffic, no crowds, and not much going on once the sun goes down. That kind of quiet is hard to explain if you didn't grow up around it. In a city or even a busy suburb, there's always some kind of sound in the background. Cars pass by, people talk outside, dogs bark, music plays somewhere in the distance. But out there, when night came, it really got still. If a car came down the road, you noticed it. If someone stepped outside, you heard it. If something moved near the house, it stood out immediately because there was so little else to cover the noise. That night, I was at my Nana's house with her, my mom, and my 2 aunts. I remember us all being in the living room together, sitting around and playing a board game. I don't even remember what game it was anymore, only that it was the kind of evening that felt ordinary and relaxed. Everyone was talking, joking, and focusing on the game. I was a kid, so I was mostly just happy to be included. It felt warm and normal, the kind of family night you don't think twice about while it's happening. It was around 8 or 9 at night, not especially late for adults, but late enough that outside had gone fully dark. Inside, the living room lights were on, making the windows act almost like mirrors unless you leaned in close enough to really look out. Everything felt contained within that room. The board game, the laughter, the voices of my mom and aunts, my Nana there with us. All of it made the house feel full and settled. Then, out of nowhere, we heard something. I don't remember what the first sound was exactly. I only remember that it was enough to interrupt what we were doing. It wasn't loud in a dramatic way, not a crash or a bang that sent everyone jumping. It was more like a noise that didn't belong. Something just noticeable enough to make everyone stop and turn their attention toward it. One of us asked if someone was outside. I don't remember who said it first, but I remember the question hanging there for a second because no one had an answer. At first, I don't think anyone was truly scared. It was more confusion than fear. In a quiet country town, if you hear a noise outside, your mind goes through a few normal possibilities. Maybe it's an animal, maybe it's a neighbor, maybe someone pulled into the driveway. Maybe it's just the house making noise the way old houses sometimes do. For a few seconds, it felt like one of those moments that would probably turn out to be nothing. But then, maybe 30 seconds later, we heard it again. This time it was very clear. It sounded like heavy work boots stomping up wooden steps. That is what made the whole thing instantly unsettling, because every single person in the room heard the same thing. There was no confusion about whether a noise had happened. There was no brushing it off as someone imagining things. We all heard it, and the sound was specific. It didn't sound soft, light, or uncertain. It sounded deliberate, like someone in boots was coming up steps toward the house. The problem was, my Nana's porch wasn't made of wood. That's the detail that made everything feel wrong. Her porch was concrete and brick. It had a long concrete sidewalk attached to it. There shouldn't have been any wooden steps making that kind of sound. The noise we heard didn't match the actual structure outside the house, and I think that's the part that made the adults go from curious to creeped out. It would have been strange enough to hear footsteps coming toward the house at night, but hearing what clearly sounded like boots on wood when there was no wood there made it instantly harder to explain. The room got quiet right away. Before that, we had all been talking over each other the way families do during a game. After that sound, everybody seemed to stop at once. I remember the sudden silence almost as much as I remember the noise itself. It was the kind of silence where everyone is listening as hard as they can, trying to catch the next sound, trying to figure out if what they just heard was real. As a kid, I picked up on the mood immediately. Adults can try to hide fear, but children are good at sensing when something changes. I knew from the way everyone went still that this wasn't being taken lightly. It wasn't like someone laughed and said, "Oh, it's probably nothing." Nobody did that. Instead, people started glancing toward the windows. We began peeking outside. I say we, but really I mean the adults first, with me trying to follow what they were doing. Everyone was careful and quiet, looking out through different windows to see if anyone was actually out there. The living room suddenly felt less cozy than it had only moments before. The light inside made the dark outside seem even darker. It felt like whatever might be out there could maybe see us more easily than we could see it. One of my aunts said she thought someone was walking around the house outside. That was the moment things got even worse. Hearing a sound at the porch is one thing. Thinking someone may have been moving around the entire outside of the house is something else. I remember feeling a rush of fear when she said that. At 7 years old, I didn't understand all the practical possibilities, but I knew enough to understand that an unknown person walking around the house at night was not normal. I don't know what exactly she saw, or if she only caught movement or shadow, but she sounded serious. Nobody laughed it off. Nobody told her she was mistaken. The tension in the room rose immediately. The idea that someone was out there circling the house while all of us were inside was deeply unsettling. It made the house feel less like protection and more like something being watched from the outside. My aunt called my uncle, who was the sheriff at the time. That detail has always stood out to me, probably because it made the whole thing feel even more serious. This wasn't just a case of nervous adults overreacting to a sound. My aunt called law enforcement, and not just any deputy, but my uncle, the sheriff himself. As a child, that carried a lot of weight. It meant the adults believed enough had happened to bring in someone who could actually check the property and tell us what was going on. So we waited. That waiting is still one of the worst parts in my memory. Waiting at night when you think someone could be outside is very different from fear that comes and goes quickly. It stretches everything. Every second feels longer. Every little sound becomes important. You start imagining footsteps where there are none, movement where there is only shadow. I remember staying close to the adults and feeling like the whole house had changed. It was the same house I knew, the same room, the same family around me, but now everything felt vulnerable. I don't remember if we kept peeking through the windows the whole time or if we pulled away and stayed back from them. I only remember that none of us relaxed. Nobody returned to the board game. Nobody started another conversation. The focus had completely shifted. Everyone was listening, watching, and waiting for my uncle to arrive. When he did, I remember feeling a small sense of relief, because as a kid, an adult in uniform felt like safety. If anyone could figure out what was going on, it would be him. He knew the area, knew the property, and knew what to look for. In my mind, he was going to come in, tell us exactly what had made the noise, and make everything normal again. Instead, he went out and searched the property. I can still picture that part in a loose way, even if the details are blurred by time. The adults were focused on him being outside, checking around the house and the yard, looking for any sign that someone had been there. This was not a quick glance from the porch. He actually searched the property. That alone tells me now, as an adult, that he took it seriously enough to investigate properly. And yet, after all of that, he found nothing. No person, no evidence, no sign that anyone had been there at all. That was the part that stayed with me the longest. If he had found footprints, it would have been creepy, but explainable. If he had found someone hiding nearby, that would have been frightening, but still grounded in reality. If he had found some reason for the noise, even a simple one, the night could have been folded into a normal memory. But there was nothing. Nothing to point to, nothing to explain the sound of boots, nothing to confirm who or what might have been outside. And that nothing somehow felt worse. It left the whole thing hanging in the air with no answer. As a child, that unsettled me more than I could fully explain at the time. Kids want adults to have answers. Even scary answers can be easier to handle than no answer at all. But that night, the adults didn't get one either. Everyone had heard the sound. At least one person thought they saw movement outside. My uncle searched the property and found no evidence of anybody being there. So, what exactly had we heard? That question stayed in my mind. Over time, I've tried to think of normal explanations. Maybe sound carried in a strange way. Maybe something else made a noise that resembled boots on wood. Maybe an animal knocked something over in just the right way. Maybe someone really had been there, but left before my uncle arrived and simply didn't leave anything noticeable behind. Those explanations are possible, at least in theory. But the reason the story has stayed with me is because of how specific it felt in the moment. It did not sound vague or uncertain. It did not sound like random noise. It sounded like work boots stomping up wooden steps. And again, there were no wooden steps. That little detail changes everything, at least in the way the memory feels. It takes the experience out of the category of someone may have been outside and turns it into something harder to pin down. Even if there was a real person out there, why did the sound not match the structure of the porch? Why did everyone hear the same thing? Why did my aunt think someone was walking around the house? And why did my uncle find absolutely nothing? I still think part of what made the whole event so unsettling was the setting. If it had happened in a busy neighborhood, maybe the sound would have blended in with other things. Maybe there would have been more likely explanations. But in a small country town, in a quiet brick house at night, where every unusual sound stands out, it felt different. It felt isolated. The silence around the house made whatever happened feel sharper and more real. The house itself also played a role in how the memory settled in me. A brick ranch in a quiet town sounds solid and safe, and in most ways it was. But when something unexplained happens around a house like that, the stillness and simplicity of the setting make it even stranger. There was nothing chaotic about the scene. No storm, no party, no neighborhood activity. Just a quiet family night, interrupted by the unmistakable sound of something that shouldn't have been there. I've thought about the adults' reactions many times too. What makes this memory stronger than a lot of childhood fears is that I wasn't the only one affected. This wasn't just a kid hearing something strange and getting scared on my own. My Nana heard it. My mom heard it. My aunts heard it. One of my aunts believed she saw someone moving around outside, and my uncle, the sheriff, took it seriously enough to come out and search the place. The fear wasn't imagined by a child alone. It was shared by the adults in the room, and that gave it a kind of weight that stayed with me. That night didn't turn into some dramatic family legend where everyone had a theory and kept retelling it in detail every holiday. At least not that I remember. It was more like one of those strange family moments that people never fully solve, so it just settles into the past unfinished. But for me, being the child in the room when it happened, it made a deep impression. It taught me how unsettling a simple sound can be when it comes at the wrong time, in the wrong place, with no explanation afterward. Even now, decades later, I can still imagine that sudden break in the evening. One moment, we were playing a board game in a warm living room, surrounded by family, doing something ordinary and harmless. The next moment, everyone was still, listening to what sounded like boots climbing steps that did not exist. Then came the window peeking, the fear that someone was outside, the call to my uncle, and finally the most unsettling part of all, the fact that there was nothing there when he looked. No evidence, no footprints that I ever heard about, no person, no reason. Just a strange sound that every person in the room heard, followed by a search that turned up absolutely nothing. I still don't know what was outside that night, or even if there really was anyone outside at all. All I know is that for a few minutes in my Nana's quiet country house, the whole mood of the evening changed. A safe, ordinary family night turned into something tense and eerie, and nobody ever got a clear answer as to why. That may be why I still remember it so well. Not because something terrible happened, but because something unexplained did, and sometimes that lingers longer. To this day, when I think about quiet country houses and the way sound travels at night, I think of my Nana's brick ranch, that board game on the table, and the sound of what seemed like heavy work boots stomping up wooden steps that were never there in the first place. A few days before the first anniversary of my Nan's death, I had an evening that I still cannot explain, no matter how many times I have gone over it in my head. I have replayed every detail, tried to think of logical reasons for each thing that happened, and even separated the events one by one to see if maybe each of them had an ordinary explanation on its own. But the problem is not just that one strange thing happened. It was the number of things that happened, one after another, over the space of about 2 hours, all of them connected to her in some way. On their own, maybe each moment could have been dismissed. Together, they felt impossible to ignore. By the end of that evening, both my husband and I were sitting there in a state of shock, grief, and something very close to acceptance, because it truly felt like she was there with us. My Nan had been gone for almost a year at that point. The anniversary of her death was coming up, and I think that time of year already carries a kind of weight when you are grieving someone deeply. Even if you try not to focus on it, your body and mind seem to know the date is near. The days leading up to it can feel heavy without you even realizing why. Little memories come back more easily. Certain routines remind you of them. You notice their absence more than usual. That is how things felt for me then. I was missing her anyway, and I think part of me was already emotionally raw because of the time of year. She had been such an important person in my life. Nan was one of those people whose presence stayed with you even after they left the room. She had her own habits, her own interests, and all those small details that become even more precious after someone dies. One of the things that always stood out about her was how much feeding birds meant to her. It sounds like such a simple thing, but it wasn't simple to her. It mattered. It was part of who she was. She took joy in it in a way that felt very pure and gentle. So when birds came up later that evening, it hit me hard because it felt like such a specifically her thing. That night started like any other normal evening at home. There was nothing dramatic or unusual about the beginning of it. My husband and I were downstairs in the living room, just going about our evening in the ordinary way. The house felt normal. The atmosphere was calm. There was no reason at all for me to think anything strange was about to happen. If anything, it was the kind of quiet evening that usually passes without leaving much of a memory behind. Then, at some point, we started hearing footsteps upstairs. At first, it was the kind of thing you don't react strongly to right away. Houses make sounds. People mishear things. Sometimes the noise of one room carries in a strange way and sounds like it's coming from somewhere else. So when we first heard what sounded like someone walking upstairs, I don't think either of us immediately jumped to anything weird. But the sound kept happening. It wasn't just a single creak or a one-off noise you could brush away. It genuinely sounded like someone was moving around up there. Then it got even stranger. We would hear the footsteps upstairs, and then it would sound like whoever it was walked right up to the living room door. That was the part that really got our attention, because the sound felt purposeful. It felt like movement with direction, like someone coming toward us. Each time we heard it, it felt so clear that one of us would go and open the door expecting to find someone there. But every time we opened the door, there was no one there. That happened more than once. It wasn't just one odd sound followed by one nervous check. It kept repeating in a way that made the house feel different. The silence after opening the door was awful too. You expect some kind of explanation when you go looking for the source of a sound. A person, a pet, something that makes you say, "Oh, that's all it was." But there was never anything, just emptiness. Just the normal stillness of the house staring back at us. After the first few times, we both started looking at each other differently, not in a dramatic horror movie way, but in that quiet, unsettled way people do when both of them know something is off, but neither wants to be the first to say it out loud. We were both hearing it. That mattered. It wasn't just one person imagining things while the other stayed skeptical. My husband heard it too. He heard the walking upstairs. He heard what sounded like footsteps approaching the living room door, and he experienced the same weird emptiness each time we opened it. Then other things started happening. At one point, an alarm clock suddenly went off. That alone would have been startling, but what made it so strange was the setting it used. It started making bird sounds, and that was not a setting that was ever used. It wasn't like the usual alarm we were familiar with. It was bird sounds, and the second I heard that, my mind went straight to Nan. Feeding birds had been so important to her that hearing bird sounds suddenly go off in the middle of everything else felt deeply personal. It wasn't just strange. It felt pointed, like something chosen. Again, if that had happened on its own, maybe I could have brushed it off as a random technical glitch or some accidental setting change. But it was happening in the middle of everything else. The footsteps, the presence at the door, the growing sense in the room that something unusual was taking place. So when the bird sounds went off, it didn't feel random. It felt like another thread tying the whole evening back to her. Then came the numbers. I remember looking at numbers from a toy that had appeared on the floor, and somehow they had ended up arranged in ways that lined up with her birthday, and even with her name. The numbers 712 appeared, and when arranged a certain way, they looked like Liz. That was her name. Even writing that now still gives me chills, because it sounds like the kind of detail people might think was forced after the fact, but in the moment it felt immediate and obvious. It felt like one of those things you see and instantly know is connected, even if you can't fully explain how or why. It was not just that the numbers were there. It was the way they lined up with her specifically. Her birthday, her name, all within the same 2-hour stretch in which everything else was already happening. By that point, it was getting harder and harder to keep telling ourselves that each little thing meant nothing. Individually, maybe, but altogether, it was too much. Too many details, too many connections, too much of her woven through the evening. The whole house began to feel charged somehow, as if every little sound and object had become part of something we were only half understanding. My husband and I kept noticing one thing after another, and each new detail seemed to push us further away from ordinary explanations. We were not running around screaming or trying to make it into something dramatic. If anything, the strongest feeling was disbelief. We kept experiencing it, then looking at each other as if to silently confirm, yes, that just happened. Yes, you heard that too. Yes, that is as strange as it seems. Grief has a way of opening people up to things they might normally dismiss. I know that. I have thought about that many times since. When you miss someone badly enough, maybe you start noticing patterns more. Maybe you become more emotionally sensitive to anything that reminds you of them. I understand all of that. But even with that in mind, that evening felt different. It did not feel like me reaching for signs. It felt like signs arriving one after another, whether I was ready for them or not. And then my daughter came downstairs. That part is the one that affected me the most, and it is the part I still cannot explain at all. My daughter is nonverbal autistic, and she has very clear, very specific ways of responding to people. One thing she does, but only under certain circumstances, is that when a visitor is sitting on the sofa, she will come and sit on my lap on the sofa, then look directly at the visitor and do a very distinctive motion with her fingers. She shakes them up and down in front of her face while staring joyfully at the person. It is not random. It is not a small thing she does to empty space. It is her way of joyfully engaging with someone she perceives as being there. It is familiar enough that I know exactly what it means when she does it. So when she came downstairs that evening, climbed onto my lap, and started doing that exact move while staring at the space next to me on the sofa at head height, it shook me to my core. She did not glance around casually. She did not act vague or distracted. She stared at that exact space constantly, joyfully, for 10 uninterrupted minutes. 10 minutes. That is a long time to watch a child do something so specific with such focus. It wasn't a passing moment that could be written off. It went on, to the point where both my husband and I were no longer just unsettled. We were overwhelmed. By then, after everything else that had already happened in those 2 hours, seeing her behave that way toward an empty space beside me felt like the final thing that tipped us over into acceptance. I started crying. I couldn't help it. The tears came because suddenly the whole evening no longer felt like a collection of odd moments. It felt deeply personal. It felt emotional. It felt like somehow Nan was there, next to me, on the sofa, and that my daughter was interacting with her the way she would with any other visitor. That is what made it so powerful. It wasn't vague. It wasn't symbolic. It felt immediate and relational, like my daughter was seeing someone we could not. By that point, my husband and I were both completely open to the possibility that she was there somehow. I know how unbelievable that sounds. If someone else had told me this story before it happened to me, I might have struggled to know what to think. But when you are in the room, when you have lived through 2 solid hours of things linked specifically to one person you love and miss, and then your child behaves in a way that fits perfectly with the idea that there is someone beside you, it changes your resistance. It changes what feels possible. And the reason it felt so convincing was because our daughter would never do that if no one was there. That was what we both kept coming back to. She would not just perform that exact joyful visitor behavior toward nothing. Not like that. Not for that long. Not with that level of focus and consistency. She looked right beside me, at the height where a person sitting on the sofa would be. Not at the ceiling, not at some random corner, not in a vague way. It was specific. And she kept going, happily and calmly, as if she were fully engaged with whoever she believed was sitting there. I was overwhelmed with emotion. Part of me was comforted. Part of me was frightened. Part of me felt like I was in one of those rare moments in life where the usual rules no longer seemed solid. Grief and love and disbelief were all tangled together in me at once. I wanted it to be real. I didn't know how it could be real. I was crying because I missed my Nan, because I wanted her close, because it felt like something impossible was happening, and because I did not know what to do with any of it. Then I said something that changed everything. I said, "It really feels like she's here, but she can't be here." I remember the words because I have replayed them so many times since. At the time, I think I was trying to ground myself. I was trying to say out loud what my rational mind still clung to, even as every part of the evening pushed against it. It was my attempt to hold on to logic, to remind myself that however strong the feeling was, Nan was gone. She could not literally be there. The moment I said that, my daughter stopped. Completely. After 10 uninterrupted minutes of staring joyfully at that space beside me and doing that familiar finger movement, she suddenly stopped and turned to me. Then she slowly hid her face in my chest and sucked her thumb, like a child who has been startled and now needs comfort. That change broke me even more. The shift was so immediate and so different from what had come before. It was not a gradual loss of interest. It was not her getting distracted and wandering off. It was as if something about the moment had changed for her too. She stopped, turned to me, and sought comfort in exactly the way a child does when something has unsettled them. My husband said he thought my Nan must have taken my words as a sign that she wasn't welcome and that maybe she disappeared, which frightened our daughter. That idea hit me hard because, in the emotional state I was in, it made a painful kind of sense. I had spent the whole evening slowly opening to the possibility that she was there, only to say out loud that she could not be there. And right after I said it, my daughter reacted as though whatever she had been seeing or engaging with was suddenly gone. Whether that is what truly happened, I can't say. I still don't know. But in that moment, it felt like I had interrupted something delicate and real. That possibility filled me with guilt as much as sadness. What if she had been there? What if, somehow, against everything I thought I understood about life and death, she had come close to us on that evening, because the anniversary was near, because something drew her back, because love doesn't always end as cleanly as we tell ourselves it does. And what if, in my fear and disbelief, I had pushed that away? I know how strange that sounds, and I know there are many people who would immediately explain the whole evening in practical terms. Footsteps can be misheard, alarms can glitch, toys can get moved, children can behave in ways we don't fully understand. I know all of those arguments. I have used them on myself many times. I have tried to lay the evening out in a neat line of possible explanations, one by one, until it all looks ordinary again. But every time I do that, I come back to the same problem. It was not one thing. It was many things in just 2 hours. Many things all connected to her. And then my daughter. That is the part I cannot reduce into something simple. I knew my child. I knew that behavior. I knew what it meant when she did it with visitors. Seeing her do it for 10 continuous minutes toward the exact space next to me on the sofa, during a night already full of moments linked to my Nan, was unlike anything I had ever experienced before or since. Even now, years later, when I think about that evening, I can feel the same mixture of emotions rising in me. There is grief, of course, because everything about that night was tied to missing her. There is comfort, too, because a part of me still believes that maybe she really was there in some way, and that for a brief window of time, the distance between our world and whatever comes after death did not feel quite so absolute. There is also pain, because I still wonder about the moment I said she couldn't be there and what changed after that. Mostly, though, there is mystery. I cannot explain the footsteps we both heard. I cannot explain why the alarm clock suddenly went off with bird sounds on an unused setting. I cannot explain the numbers from the toy appearing in ways that connected to her birthday and her name. I cannot explain why my daughter came downstairs and behaved exactly as she would with a real visitor sitting beside me. And I cannot explain why she stopped the moment I said those words and then turned to me for comfort as if something had suddenly frightened her. All I know is that a few days before the first anniversary of my Nan's death, for about 2 hours, my home felt filled with her in ways I had never experienced before. The sounds, the objects, the timing, the emotions, and finally my daughter's reaction, all built into something so powerful that by the end of it, both my husband and I felt there was no other honest way to describe it except this. It felt like she was there. I still can't explain anything about that evening. Maybe I never will, but I know what it felt like to live through it, and that feeling has never left me. The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.